Welcome to the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. This is Jeff Strauss. Before I jump into my introduction, I want to send a heartfelt acknowledgement to my Los Angeles neighbors. I record the Leadership Bootcamp podcast out of my home office in Burbank, California, and we are surrounded by major fires that you may have heard of or been affected by directly. And I want to tell all of my LA neighbors that my heart goes out to you. We are here for you. We will stand Los Angeles strong as we do when we encounter catastrophic natural events like fires or floods, both of which we've experienced in the last 12 months together. And I know how hard it is. We here in Burbank are not directly affected by the flames, thankfully, but we stand with you who are. Those individuals who are experiencing a repeat of the 2018 Woodley fire, who may have lost homes and have lost homes in this 2025 fire, particularly devastating. And so I don't want to start any podcast or really any public outreach without acknowledging the difficulty that Angelenos are going through right now. And it extends to those beyond the fire zones as well. Air quality in a number of areas of Los Angeles is dangerous. And many folks, including myself in my neighborhood, are not advised to be walking outside without masks on because of the air quality. And other neighborhoods like Pasadena, who are affected by the Eaton fire, can't bathe or drink their water from their water supply system because it's been rendered unsafe by debris and toxins. So it is a very difficult time for Los Angeles. We will get through this. It is not a time for toxic positivity. There is not a lot of silver lining here. It's going to be a difficult thing to recover from. It's going to take years, and it will require community to work together to do it. Unfortunately, there are those elements that are dividing us, looters, arsonists, that are continuing to sow discord within our communities. But we need to stand above those things and work together to rebuild, and we will. Because just like any catastrophic event that occurs in this nation, it is really during those times that we see the strength and bonds of our communities and how we come together. And so I anticipate that to occur this time. And I will be doing my part to donate and provide efforts to any services or programs that are designed to help those who have been displaced by the fires. And I will say that this year I will be making an extra focus on donating everything that I can monetarily to our extremely brave and under-resourced firefighters. These are the individuals on the front line who are keeping us safe, and they need all the support they can get. They are working around the clock tirelessly to keep us from burning to the ground. So, that said, I stand with you, and I wish you the very best. Today's podcast episode, I'm excited to bring you because it is my first video podcast episode. I haven't done one of these before. I've done other videos before. If you are familiar with my website, my lecture series or my Leader to Leader series, those are all video series. But this is my first video podcast. And I'm particularly excited because my guest today is Dr. Max Bazerman. Dr. Bazerman is a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. He is the winner of numerous awards for his contributions to the field of management, organizational behavior, and business ethics, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management. Dr. Bazerman is the author of such indispensable books as Judgment in Managerial Decision Making, which I refer to on a regular basis. I love that book and I highly recommend it. The Power of Noticing What the Best Leaders See. Complicit, How We Enable the Unethical and How to Stop. And now, the forthcoming Negotiation, The Game Has Changed, which is the subject of today's discussion. All of Dr. Bazerman's publications are available on Amazon or through your local bookstore. And I'm very excited for this interview because I have a growing Bazerman section in my personal library. And as I mentioned, I regularly refer to his work in my own leadership and negotiation practices, and I have recommended them to colleagues and friends who have found them as relevant and useful as I have. Dr. Bazerman's work is widely read and also widely cited in the academic literature. Dr. Bazerman and I discuss how COVID changed the game in terms of teaching in general and negotiations specifically, ethical negotiations, what still surprises and challenges him about negotiations, things that you can do right now to improve your negotiation skills, besides, of course, buying his book, Negotiation, the Game Has Changed, veganism, and other topics. And now I'm very pleased and honored to bring you Dr. Max Bazerman. Max, thank you so much for joining me on the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. It is a real pleasure to talk to you. I read your book, Negotiation, the Game Has Changed, and I'd love to ask you a few questions and have a discussion about that book for a little bit longer.
That'd be terrific. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast, Jeff.
It is an absolute pleasure. So I wanted to get started with one thing that struck me almost immediately when I read the book, which is a bit different than the other books of yours that I've read, which is the format. The beginning of each chapter of Negotiation, the Game Has Changed is a case study, and the end of each chapter is the recapitulation of that case study and sort of a synthesis of the concepts that you talk about in that chapter. Is there a particular reason you decided to design the chapters in this way? I personally found it a very meaningful design decision.
Yes, there are a couple of reasons. So let me step back and say, this is the third book I've written on negotiation. I wrote a book in 1992 with Maggie Neal called Negotiating Rationally, and in 2007 with my excellent colleague Deepak Malhotra, I wrote Negotiation Genius, which continues to sell well today. And, I'm very proud of both of those books. But when I look at these books, they actually look dated, which is a surprise to me, in the sense that I've always thought of myself as somebody who works from basic concepts out. And our basic concepts of negotiation, in terms of knowing your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, reservation price, ZOPA, anchors, etc., are relevant today just as they were 30 years ago. But there have been a variety of changes in the world that increasingly leads people to say, but does this apply to me? And the first chapter of the book talks about some of the changes that have occurred in the world, from the fact that we negotiate online on a regular basis, to China as a world power, to even my teaching. I never thought I was going to teach on Zoom, and I became a regular teaching on Zoom because of significant changes in the world. And so the chapters each open with a question that has some quirk to it. It's not an example that I'm likely to have run into 20 years ago. And I then sort of ask the question that either an actual person asked me, or it's an amalgamation of a few questions that I've heard over time. And then I present the chapter, and then I close by hopefully conveying that the concepts in the chapter are actually helpful for answering the very practical question that the person had asked about. So what's different, what's unique about these questions is they tend to have a contemporary flair to them and represent some of the ways in which the game has changed over time. So for me, Negotiation, the Game Has Changed is a bit of a surprise, because negotiation has historically varied from people like me who work from the concepts out versus people who start with practical problems and work their way in to try to find the right concepts. And being kind of a nuts and bolts guy who works from concepts out to now paying more attention to the ways in which the game has changed is an important difference that this book has from other writing that I've done in the past.
I think it's so interesting that you mentioned how contemporary each of those questions are, because I found myself almost every chapter finding some really deep personal relevance in the questions, almost like I'm experiencing that now, or that's something so realistic to have experienced. And it made me even so interested in some of the things, some of the sort of simulations that you mentioned that you do in your classes. It was really intriguing because I kept thinking to myself, I wonder what those simulations are like, because if the examples, if these sort of situations or these amalgamations of questions that you're starting each chapter with have that much relevance, it must be so exciting and fun to actually sit in a simulation as a student or sort of an executive student of yours and actually go through something so relevant.
Yeah, so for a very long time, negotiations has focused on participant-centered learning, but the participant-centered learning isn't a typical case where you read 20 pages and then discuss it, but rather we use simulations where people read a role description, they go off and negotiate, and then the class consists of debriefing what happened across the 30 different pairs who were negotiating the exact same case, who come back with dramatically different results. And the class focuses on what strategies led to better and worse results. And people are given the opportunity to audit what they do. But even, I'm going to pick the simulations and the context for the simulations based on what I think is going to be generally helpful. And that doesn't stop students from saying, does this apply in my country? Does this apply in my industry? Does this apply during the supply crisis that occurred after the Great Recession? Does this apply during COVID? Again, supply crisis or mode of communication. And I think that my overall answer is yes, it applies, but we may need to give some serious consideration to how do we think about negotiating when our three-person team is negotiating online and we're not even sitting in the same room. So I can't just turn my head and talk to the person next to me to develop whether or not we're comfortable moving forward with what the other side has just proposed. So the fact that the world has changed has had some very important implications for how we prepare for and how we engage in our negotiations.
I can definitely see that as somebody who works fully remotely all the time. My industry is tech. I'm on Zooms all day long. And I wonder, have you experienced through your growing comfort with teaching online that certain aspects of negotiation are much harder? Like you mentioned, turning to, maybe leaning over and whispering to your neighbor about doing something that becomes much more difficult.
Absolutely. So I think that any of us who used to do things face-to-face, who now do those things online, have sort of dealt with the dramatic challenges. So let's put negotiation aside for about 2 minutes. Sort of when COVID hit in 2020, I was in the middle of teaching. And all of a sudden I got my memo from the dean's office saying, you're not teaching in person anymore, you're teaching online. And quite frankly, I assumed that I would be able to retire without teaching online. I had no expectations of being an online negotiation teacher, but there I was, and being sort of managing all the tech aspects and not knowing how to look for faces regularly and what things I need to tell my students in advance. It was all a major jolt, and I thought, I thought my teaching performance went way, way down. And I even called, I was so unhappy with what I perceived to be my lower performance. I called a consulting client of mine who I was on very good terms with, and I said to them, I want to teach a 2-day training program for the company, no charge. And they said, why do you want to do that? And I said, because I need a practice. Within months, I had sort of adapted, and I started to learn some of the amazing features of teaching on Zoom. And I don't mean to advertise for Zoom over Teams or Google or whatever, but there's lots of things you can do online, like have everybody put their answer into chat and send it at the same time so that you could see where the debates are, so you could guide who do you call on in the discussion. So there were lots of wonderful opportunities, but you had to learn to adapt. Now, if we switch to negotiations, there are just lots of people who were used to flying to another city to meet with a potential customer, and there are certain aspects of social interaction that are far richer in person than they are in email. And I think Zoom kind of falls in between. It's not as rich as being in person. It's a lot richer than email. I would argue it's richer than a telephone conversation as well. But how do you make up for the lack of richness? How do you make up for the fact that so often we want to have more than one person on our side, And now all of a sudden, my team isn't even in the same location. Good if I have a secondary way of communicating with my partners before one of us blurts out something to the other side. But this requires more preparation. Harry Kurtzberg, a professor at Rutgers, has done lots and lots of research on sort of the aspects of Zoom negotiations that matter. Screen size matters. So the richer we can make it, the better off we are. We're going to be better at finding creative ways to expand the pie if we're in a richer version. When people are multitasking, it destroys trust. We didn't used to sort of worry about the problem of multitasking while negotiating. If the person was in front of you, you had their attention. That's no longer true. There's an awful lot of multitasking. By the way, as I'm talking to you, Jeff, I'm not writing any paper, and I'm not responding to any emails. I'm just talking to you. And how we think about our interaction can be absolutely critical.
I definitely agree there. When I coach at my job and I either coach my team or I'm talking with others, one of the things that I mentioned, particularly, I've given a couple of trainings on giving effective feedback. And one of the things that I find so important is it's very noticeable if somebody just does this, and you make an immediate assumption, oh, they're checking a Slack or they're checking an email or they're doing this other thing. You'll see me look off to the side during this conversation, but that's only because that's where my questions are. But yeah, it's very noticeable to see that sort of thing. And nowadays, it's true. If we were sitting in front of each other and I had a portfolio of a folio of documents and I was writing something down, the assumption is that I'm writing something down pertinent to the conversation that we're having. Now you really don't know if that's true, and your brain starts to make all kinds of different assumptions.
Absolutely. And more of us are working at home, and stuff happens at home, and our partners want to just quickly get 10 seconds of our time, and the dog or cat or child walks by, and on and on and on.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking as you were beginning the story, that company that you called to consult for to practice online teaching had the easiest price negotiation imaginable.
Yeah, they're really good people. They had paid me quite fairly on other projects, and I was delighted to provide them with sort of value to them, but it provided value to me. I needed practice.
Absolutely.
And it was a techie company, so they could help me out on the tech side. Since they were going to be my first off-site negotiation Zoom client. So all in all, it was a fine trade, and I was perfectly happy with the fee of $0.
Out of curiosity, based on that experience, did you have any revelations as to tactics or approaches to teaching that you needed to change based on that experience?
Absolutely. So I saw lots of limitations within me on the tech side. I often teach 60, 80, 100 people, and that included online teaching. I found switching screens to find people to be very, very difficult, to just keep track of people. And I went with a kind of rule of thumb, and it worked for me on Zoom. I assume that the other platforms work similarly. But went with a rule of thumb, if I need to see them, they'll show up on page 1. So when you raise your hand, you move to page 1.
That's right.
When you talk, you move to page 1. Limiting myself to page 1, knowing that there were people on pages 2 and 3. But those folks had to raise their hand to move up to page 1, or at least send something in chat in order to get my attention. And that's kind of part of my coping. And again, I'm sure people negotiating need to adapt strategies as well for dealing with the complexity of negotiating online. Particularly, oftentimes we hand people a sheet of paper. Now we're sharing a screen as we do that, and sort of just thinking through all those steps. So in many ways, I think that preparing to negotiate on Zoom requires more preparation than preparing face-to-face. On the other hand, you sure are saving a lot of flight time by your ability to negotiate on Zoom.
Certainly true. One of the other things, I wonder if you've experienced this, I experience this very frequently, is the scope of the conversations get much, much larger in terms of participants because it's so easy and an online discussion can cross time zones so much easier. I tend to notice that I have meetings with a lot of people in them, and many people who may not need to be there. Is there an upper limit or a time where the benefit of scale works against a negotiation?
Yeah, so I wouldn't give a number, but I think you raised something interesting. If there's 6 of them on the other side of the negotiation, sort of expecting them to say yes to your last proposal, in most cases is going to be unreasonable. So the fact that there's 6 of them and they're not sitting in the same room, you need to realize that they probably need to huddle to go over anything concrete that you put on the table. So you should expect a different process because you're negotiating on Zoom. They don't have the opportunity to say, "Can you step out for 10 minutes while we discuss your last proposal?" Since they don't, you may need to either sort of disappear for a while on Zoom, or more likely propose we follow up the next day to discuss next steps. So I think you want to be as concrete as possible to move things forward. At the same time, I think you need to cope with the limitations that we have because we're often in different places.
That's such an interesting sort of paradox because, an online Zoom or Meet or whatever it is enables communication so much more efficiently, but then it's possible that the length of negotiation could be extended by the fact that people sort of need to get together and huddle sort of by themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think sometimes I hear the question, so is it harder or easier to negotiate? The answer is yes. It's harder and easier in different ways. And we need to think that through so that we're optimally prepared.
Yeah, to take that back to negotiation, the game has changed. The whole sort of overarching concept of the book is context. And I find that to be so important because context really does matter, and different nuances of every particular situation necessitate an approach unique to that particular nuance. I found that to be a very meaningful approach to the writing.
So thank you. So I find it, again, paradoxical in the sense that typically I was a nuts and bolts out to the problem guy, but the context has changed in some pretty dramatic ways. So whether you think about the Great Recession or you think about COVID, but both were shocks to the system. And one of the things that happens when there's big shocks to the system is that a lot of things go on hold, and there's lots of things that would have occurred as new deals that kind of get put on the sideline. On the other hand, there's a variety of things that we might call disputes. You and I already have an agreement. Mm-hmm. But because of COVID or because of the dramatic shift in the economy during the Great Recession, the deal that we already agreed to doesn't make sense. And we need to get back together again and think about how to reformulate our agreement given the new context. Because, the way I read the contract that I signed with you, yes, you can clobber me. Unfortunately, if you choose to clobber me, I'll be out of business and you won't even be able to get the supplies that you need as a result. So one side may have power because of the surprising shift, but they may not be able to implement it. So we may need to come back together and resolve disputes. And in the book, there's a whole chapter to a case written by my colleagues Nor Catelli and Deepak Malhotra on the English Premier League, the soccer league. They call it football, but in the U.S. we call it soccer. But sort of how they needed to cope with how they're going to complete the season and how the rules had to change because of the potential challenges of not being able to complete all the games due to COVID. So when the world shifts, we often have disputes, and we don't have the option of walking away and deciding I'm going to do a deal with somebody else, because our dispute is going to continue whether or not we constructively stop and resolve it or not. So those are some of the kind of major ways in which we see jolts having a dramatic impact, and the ways in which when the game changes, we need to adapt in logical and reasonable ways.
I loved that case study in the book, by the way. It was a really grounded, realistic, coachable, and such a broadly applicable example. It had every feature Every feature was in there.
So I agree with you. Again, it's not my case. I borrowed the story from Noor Katali and Deepak Malhotra, and I'm not a what U.S. calls a soccer fan, and so it wasn't the sport per se. It was the story which I found absolutely kind of fascinating, and to basically jump in and learn how this whole process works and how the sport operates in dramatically different ways than baseball, football, or basketball that I see in the U.S. to a very, very different structure, and how that got interrupted by COVID was kind of a joy to learn about and then to document.
So I want to follow up on the Premier League case study, and although I don't have it detailed in my notes, so I'm going to forget some of the particular individuals in that case study, but one thing that stood out to me was I don't remember the position, the president or the CEO of the Premier League.
Greg Clark, yeah.
Greg Clark. One of his, I guess you could say ultimatum, correct me if that's not the right word, was there was an ultimatum that he put in which was something to the effect, if I recall correctly, of there must be a system in place where teams get voted out of the Premier League, or there was some ultimatum that he would not let go. Do you recall what that was?
Sure. So the English Football League, as best I understand it from reading the work of Noor and Deepak, is in 4 groups of 20. So if you think of, for simplicity, A, B, C, and D League, they have other names. But the A League is the best league. And there's much more money involved in being in the A group than in the B group. But every year, the bottom 3 teams from the A group drops to the B group, and the top 3 from the B group move up to the A group, and it's called relegation. And so there were some teams in the A League who basically had thoughts of, well, if we can't complete the season because of COVID, well, then we obviously can't relegate. But meanwhile, there's going to be 3 teams in the B League who have the attitude, no, we have a legal agreement that 3 of us are moving up, so 3 of you are going to have to move down. So you have teams who want to fight the battle against the B League, but you have Greg Clark, who basically is concerned with the overall system, who, in a very interesting way, in this online discussion with the 20 teams in league, basically says, we can do whatever you guys want. I don't want to impose anything on you. But of course, we need to follow our legal obligations, which means 3 of you are getting relegated one way or the other. He was in the process breaking up a coalition of teams who were potentially going to hold together and say, let's not relegate this year. Of course, that would have created a lawsuit, but they were willing to take that lawsuit rather than be at the risk of being relegated. And Clark basically did a good job of busting up that coalition with this seemingly reasonable statement. I just want to do what you want to do, but of course relegation has to take place.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. It was relegation was the term I was looking for.
Yeah.
How do you feel that systems of power come into play in a negotiation? Do you feel like in that particular case, and I'm sort of using this specific, and you can generalize from this, do you feel like Clark and others perhaps in a position like that are able to wield power in a way that influences a negotiation? And how do you feel like that affects negotiations in general?
Yeah, sure. So I think anybody who has this coordinating role has some power, but he was concerned that 6 or 7 teams were going to form together as a coalition to work against him. So sometimes a large number of people with less power form together and in fact end up with more power. So we see governments fall. So Justin Trudeau a month ago had a lot of power in Canada, and that seems to have dissipated as other coalitions decided maybe not. So it's a bit of a power, it's a bit of a dynamic on how power exists. And I think that, in lots of cases, as a teacher, I'll get questions from people who are in low power positions to say, how do I get sort of half of the goodies with a person in high power? And the answer may be, you can't, because they can find other deals other than dealing with you, of somebody who's going to be perfectly happy with 20% coming from a position of low power. On the other hand, low power people might have strategies that in fact can increase their power, one of the ways in which people can increase their power is by to develop their options, or what Fisher and Uri long ago called developing your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So I always find it intriguing that people who go into a car dealership feel like they're in the low power position because they only buy a car once every 6 years, and they're negotiating with people who negotiate multiple times a day. But it's the buyer who can look up the price, that the dealer paid for that car online, and can potentially go to multiple dealerships. So the seemingly low power person can change the power dynamics by realizing that they can improve their BATNA by thinking about their options.
One of the things that struck me when I read Negotiation, the Game Has Changed is something that probably struck me as I've read your other books as well, including Judgment in Managerial Decision Making, which is, I think, a much more straightforward, almost academic read than some of the other ones, which are they're a bit more story. There's more of a narrative around them, is the BATNA. And I think just having that drilled into me yet again from Negotiation, the Game Has Changed has already in the last couple of weeks affected how I approach even conversations where I might not have thought about them as potential negotiations to begin with. So on that note, if there was a piece of advice that you could give to people right now who are like, I'm going to go buy a car tomorrow, or, I have to talk to I was about to say I have to talk to my spouse about something, but that triggered my memory of a portion of the book where you mentioned context matters, and is fighting about who takes the dog out on a walk really the hill that you want to die on? Is that really an important negotiation? But if someone were to go out and engage in an important negotiation, what is one thing that they could think of or do without having read any of your books that could help improve their positions?
And you don't want the advice to be go read my book, right?
Of course, I will happily give that advice to everybody.
So assuming they're not going to go read the book. So, what you're asking me is probably the most common cocktail party conversation question I get. And so I'll give you asked for one, I'm going to give you two answers. One, in most negotiations, the pie isn't fixed. So if you go into the negotiation and look for ways to make wise trade-offs to expand the pie, those options are there. The more complicated the negotiations, the more opportunities there are to expand the pie. So in the car story where you're going to pay an amount of money for a specific car, we might be negotiating over a fixed pie. But if we're buying a house or we're negotiating over who does what around the house, there's more than one issue at stake. And that's where we can find opportunities to find value by making wise trades across issues. So busting up the mythical fixed pie is one answer. And the other answer is think a whole lot about the perspective of the other side. So I'm not telling you to necessarily be a nice person, although that would be fine to do. I'm not telling you shouldn't have emotional empathy for them, which might be a nice thing to do. But I'm saying from a strategic perspective, you can learn so much by trying to put yourselves in the shoes of others and understand what the negotiation looks like from their perspective. So bust the mythical fixed pie and think long and hard about their perspective, and then think some more about their perspective. Those would be my two top pieces of advice.
Those are great pieces of advice. I also like the fine trade-offs across issues. That was also pretty revelatory for me. I think the way you described it was, rather than prioritizing a list of issues and negotiating one by one, look at things sort of holistically, because it allows you to find trade-offs between issues.
Yeah. So in teaching an executive program, so I run a program at the Harvard Business School called Changing the Game. It's a one-week executive program. We run it 3 times a year. It typically sells out. Get executives from around the globe, most of whom are pretty good negotiators. Yet the first negotiation where they can make trade-offs across issues and expand the pie, and if they don't, they blow millions of dollars of simulated money. It kind of blows my mind and blows their mind, the fact that experienced negotiators don't even look for the trades, and as a result, they see their result on the board and it's not as good as other pairs because they failed to bust the mythical fixed pie. So that can be revelatory even to quite experienced negotiators.
Are there things that surprise you, or is there a circumstance that has surprised you in teaching these classes or working with your students where an outcome, a negotiation outcome was out of left field, or wow, that's like a really surprising outcome I didn't expect?
So I'll give you a couple of answers. One, somehow it repeatedly surprises me that there's so much opportunity to create value that real life managers often fail to look for. And then if I move out of the classroom and I think of consulting work, I often hear people respond to something I say by saying, that doesn't work and you can pick my industry, my job, my country, whatever. And when I hear that, there's two things that might exist. One, I actually don't understand something, and if I did, I wouldn't have made the comment or suggestion that I made. Or two, they're so used to doing things in an entrenched way, and in fact, what I suggested might in fact work for them quite well. They would go back and consider that a bit more. So either I think they have something to learn, or I'm going to get to learn something about how their industry is actually different. So I'd say that kind of surprise happens kind of all the time. An example, when I run into a situation where party A and party B are arguing, can't get a deal done, but what they actually disagree about is some future unmeasurable event. Like if you buy our supply, will sales be above or below X million dollars? Mm. And the buyer doesn't want to buy if in fact the supply isn't going to produce. And I find so often that a solution is to bet on your differences, or what academics might call a contingent contract or a profit-sharing agreement. So whenever people are about to argue about some future issue that will get resolved, it just isn't resolved at the time that they're negotiating, the thing that goes off in my mind is consider a contingent contract. And people immediately don't like it because it doesn't provide closure. And the more they think about it, the more power they realize that it provides them, particularly if their expectations are in fact right, if they have a good basis for believing that their product is as good as they're claiming.
I can see that to be challenging because in my experience negotiating, which I've had to do with vendors for a long time in my industry, it's difficult to, I may not have even approached the conversation for a contingent contract in the past because I didn't even think it was something that I could do. But I can imagine it could be a difficult conversation to engage with them and say, hey, why don't I give you 50% now, and then contingent upon the performance, I give you 50% afterwards. That's a hard sell.
Yeah. So the question is why? It might be because they told you that my product's going to do X, Y, and Z for you, when in fact it's only going to do X. And if the contingency is that it has to perform, they don't want the contingent payment. On the other hand, if the outcome is likely to turn out well for them, then why wouldn't they want a contingent payment? Particularly if instead of giving them the other 50%, if it performs as expected, you're offering them 70% instead of for that 50%. So, I once had a client. It was kind of the university division of a large corporation. They called themselves Company XYZ University, and they ran courses and then other departments would sort of basically provide the students. I thought I had a tentative agreement with them for kind of a fixed fee. And then kind of the head of the university called and said, we're very nervous. Budgets are running tight this year. And we're concerned that if we finalize the agreement and enrollment comes in low, we won't be getting the fees from the divisions to cover the costs that we agreed to pay you. I said, are you expecting enrollment low? And the person said, no, we're expecting enrollment to be quite high, actually, but we'd be in trouble if they were low. I said, well, why don't you pay me half of what you offered and then also give me X dollars per person that actually shows up? And they said, well, you would do that? And I said, well, sure, I would do that. You just told me you expect enrollments to be high. Sounds like a good deal. And
yeah.
They said, great, we got a deal. And I ended up making more money because of the flexibility about the form of the contract. So, and they didn't mind paying more because, again, they had divisions paying the fees that were going to cover the extra amount that I would be receiving as a result. So whenever there's a concern about the future, I think thinking creatively about whether both parties can get most of what they need by being more flexible about the structure can be very, very helpful.
And that's such a great example about expanding, like creating value in a negotiation for both
Absolutely.
parties. What a great example. How do you suggest people reflect on negotiations they've had where if they walk away from the good negotiating table feeling bested, for example, like, so, you mention in this book and other books reflecting on the experience.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for people who walk away and say, "Oh man, I overpaid for that car"?
Yeah, so you use the word bested. And I think there's times where you do quite well, but you could have done better. So rather than thinking about times that you've been bested, I'm going to change your question to, are there ways in which you can learn from your experiences? Whether you did well and could have done better, or you actually did pretty poorly. And my answer is that we can learn a tremendous amount from our past experiences. When people come and take our executive program or take my MBA class, they're constantly getting feedback on what they could do better. In my closing session, what I highlight to them is that I'm not going to be around to kind of be pestering you about why you didn't do better in your future negotiations, but perhaps you should do that yourself. Perhaps it makes sense once a month to ask yourself, what's the most important negotiation that I've been involved in? And what is it that I could have done differently that would have allowed me to perform more effectively? Don't ask the question, why didn't you do better? Because you'll probably blame the other side or the economy. Ask yourself the question, what is it that you could have done differently that would have allowed you to perform at a more effective level? And I think that that's a really powerful question that we can all ask ourselves on a regular basis.
I agree for many more things than simply negotiation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I find that to be an underutilized and undervalued tactic for improving, in particularly the industry I'm interested in, leadership and leadership education.
Absolutely.
The very underutilized strength.
Yep. And maybe ask other people.
Right, and get feedback from others also. It's also a hard thing to do.
Yep.
But probably one of the most powerful things to do. If I may ask a personal question, not too personal, I hope, but you mentioned in the book you're vegan.
I am.
Not an easy stance to maintain. On your journey to veganism, did you engage in any self-negotiations? What kind of tribulations did you go through and sort of, things you had to convince yourself of to move into that lifestyle?
So happy to answer your question. I'm not sure how well it's going to fit into the overall theme of our discussion, but I don't mind. So really two phases. One phase happened 30 years ago where my spouse became vegetarian while I was spending 6 months in a different state. So I came back and was married to a vegetarian who did most of the cooking. And I would say I ate less and less meat. And then 3 years later, I noticed that I didn't eat meat anymore. So since I didn't eat meat anymore, I figured I must be a vegetarian. So that was shockingly simple. And during COVID, I actually led her into veganism. So I went first on the veganism issue where we kind of giving up dairy and eggs and et cetera, et cetera. And I actually became involved in the vegan investing world before I actually became vegan. And so I had more and more friends who were vegan and pretty passionate about it. And I think the fourth time I heard the phrase, it's such a privilege to be able to eat consistent with my values. I ended up going home and telling Marla, my spouse, I'm vegan. And it was literally as simple as that. And I really like this notion of rather than I'm sacrificing it and I need to negotiate with myself, I simply want to act in ways that are more consistent with my values. And this is an easy way to do to.
I can appreciate that. And I think I will try my best to bring it back to our conversation.
Go for it.
And like that adjustment of frame that you have in changing the outlook on the lifestyle. I think it's very interesting. Yeah.
And I'm not too judgmental on people who basically say, I'm a meatless Monday guy. And okay, so that's a good thing to be.
Sure.
So I'm not pure enough in my life that I should be casting stones. So I think if we all figure out ways to make ourselves better, that will put us on the right track.
On the topic of, let's say, sort of psychological insights, those biases, things of that nature. This is sort of tangential. I'm trying to work it in. You talk about ethical considerations in negotiations quite a lot. And I like the simplicity of it. Lie if you're going to save the world. Otherwise, do your best to not lie.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the use of influence tactics? Not so much lying, but, influencing, or I might use another word that you might change in your response, but perhaps exploitation of some negotiating tactics that leverage some of those psychological insights, like perhaps extreme anchoring, the Michael Jordan example you have in the book, with the potential risk of undermining long-term trust and a relationship with your counterparty?
So a whole bunch of answers. So first of all, just to clarify, in the book, in the chapter on ethics, I talk about a lie by the Kennedy administration that may have saved the world from nuclear disaster. I'd be perfectly happy to lie if it would save the world from nuclear disaster, and if someone looked down on me for that, so be it. I could live with that just fine. Generally, lying makes it harder to create value. It makes you a less trustworthy person, and I think the returns on lying and unethical behavior are not very good. Being a trustworthy negotiator is a good thing to be, but there are times when I see lies that I wouldn't condemn. If someone asks you, how does this shirt look, and you say, looks nice, when in fact you don't think it is, I'm not going to overly condemn you. When says, where are the Jews hiding in your house, and you keep them hidden and don't answer that question, I'm not going to condemn you. So I'm uncomfortable with thou shalt never lie. On the other hand, I think that lies generally create harm rather than benefit. But there are exceptions, as I've just covered. But if we move from lying to simply using influence tactics, I would start by highlighting the fact that influence tactics can be used for the good. I could be influencing you to engage in behaviors that will make you happier. So if I can influence you to not engage in self-destructive behaviors, that ends up being a good thing. I think that in normal negotiations, I think that there's a reasonable expectation that I'm going to provide information that will help convince you that I'm the supplier you want to go with. And if I'm using honest information, I'm okay with influence tactics. I'm not a big fan of intentionally deceiving the other side. So we use the word exploitative. So I'm not a big fan of using things that would be exploitative. But that doesn't mean I don't want to influence the behavior of people on a regular basis. So as I prepare for a negotiation and think about what I'm going to say to get the negotiation started, well, I don't know, am I using influence strategies by how I'm framing the negotiation? Absolutely. I don't have an ethical problem with thinking in that way. Might it help me at their expense? It's possible. It might also help both of us because I'm developing a strategy for finding where the wise trades exist so that you're going to be better off because of the influence strategies that I bring to the table. So I think you need the specific content of the influence effort before we judge whether it's a problematic behavior or not.
In my experience in the corporate sphere, negotiations are so often seen as, I am going to win this engagement, right? How do you coach the type, or how do you what's the word I'm looking for? How do you coach the type of behavior that you want to see out of sort of an ethical negotiator, where they think to themselves, let's expand the pie. We can create additional value here. When so many people, particularly in the corporate space, they're looking, let me squeeze every dollar out of this so that it looks good to the finance department. I can tell my CEO I got the 3-year contract with no additional license fee, things of that nature.
Yeah, so if I get 6 and you only get 4, I guess that's good because I got 60%. But wouldn't it have been better if I got 8 and you got 5? And that's why we want to create more value. So when I encourage people to use rational negotiation strategies, I'm not asking you to give up what's good for your bottom line and sacrifice it for the other side when you have all the ability, entitlement to do better for yourself. I find that by being a trustworthy negotiator, being really good at creating value, and then holding steady for your fair share, or even what you might think of as more than your fair share, that can be kind of just fine. So generally when I hear people talking about it, sort of as you were describing the scenario for the corporate bottom line, I was hearing a mythical fixed pie in that. Like, I'm going to squeeze the limited resources out of them. And sort of negotiating over fixed pies, we certainly deal with that in teaching negotiations, but it's a small part of what we do, and it's a value creating that's much more important. Much more important. And you asked about, is there more on ethics? There's a lot more on ethics. So I'm a big fan of what's often called utilitarian philosophy. You can think of Bentham, Mill, Peter Singer, in terms of a contemporary version, who argue that the ethical action is the one that creates the most overall value. In negotiation, sort of an ethical negotiator from a utilitarian perspective is always going to focus first and foremost on creating the biggest pie possible. But that doesn't mean that they're sacrificing. They can then do a fine job of claiming a good chunk of that big pie for themselves.
I'm really glad that I asked the question in that way, because it was such a good example of exactly the type of trap that someone can fall into. This, I think you described this so well in the book. I'm calling it the nail buff Brandenburger dilemma, where you mentioned the Alice and Bob sharing a pie. Isn't it better if Alice gets 7 slices and Bob gets 4? For those who are not familiar with that particular situation, I recommend reading the book, Negotiation, the Game Has Changed, because you describe that always the fixed pie assumption. It's such a poignant and realistic example.
Yeah, so we should give a plug here for Barry Nelmbuff's book, Split the Pie, where he basically argues that what negotiators should do is that they should agree that whatever value they're creating in negotiation above what they could each do on their own, they should basically split that 50-50. And he argues that there's lots of benefit to it. One, it's a fair thing to do. Two, if we can agree on the front end that we're going to split the surplus, then we can do a better job of working together to make sure that the surplus is kind of as large as possible. So that was the source of the Alice and Bob. I think it's Alice Cooper and Bob Marley are the Alice and Bob that he talks about in his pie splitting example. And so he talks about the elegance of it. And that it contrasts very concretely with one of the best-selling negotiation books currently is Voss's book, Never Split the Difference. And I would bet that the publisher had something to do with creating such a terrible title that would mislead people so much. The notion "never split the difference" seems us shockingly wrong, and the book provides lots of times when it doesn't make sense to split the difference, but I don't think that he provides much evidence for the never. It's almost the complete opposite of Nailbuff, who's arguing let's always split the pie as a result. And my former colleague who has passed away, Dave Messick, talks about splitting the pie as a social heuristic or rule of thumb that we use in social contexts because it's easy. Rather than argue, you ate a steak and I only, we already covered I'm a vegan. So
you have a cauliflower steak.
A vegan entree, therefore you should pay X and I should pay Y. We have a social heuristic. Why don't we just split the bill in half? And it makes life a whole lot simpler. It's almost an excuse to not discuss how to divide the pie rather than arguing that 50-50 is a particularly fair solution.
Yeah, I like the example in the book where Voss argues that only getting one hostage in a hostage negotiation, if there are 2 hostages, you don't want to split that difference.
So there's lots of interesting things in Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, but he provides examples of if your wife wants you to wear black shoes and you want to wear brown shoes, it doesn't make sense to go with one brown and one black. And similarly, 1 out of 2 hostages isn't quite good enough. So he provides evidence that splitting the difference isn't always a good solution. But it's a word never that I think leads it to be particularly bad advice. Again, there isn't much argument in the book to never split the difference. And so I've always been suspicious that a publisher who didn't even read the book may have been responsible for the title.
I also would go so far as to say that the easiest negotiations to lose are those where your spouse wants you to do something and you don't do it. I know that from personal experience, so I don't even bother.
Hopefully you'll learn from the past.
Exactly. What are you personally still challenged by in negotiations? Do you get into circumstances where things still challenge or fluster you in some way?
I wouldn't say definitely challenge. I'm not sure if fluster is the right word. So I do a lot of work in the environmental world. I'm involved in the plant-based investing world, and I'm embarrassingly weak in my knowledge of science. And so, I wish I could go back and pay attention to my high school chemistry and physics classes, but I don't have the knowledge that I would like on the technical side. And so I often find that I'm in contexts where I need to find a shortcut to catching up on technical issues in order to provide good advice. So I think that my concepts can be adapted to new environments. But sometimes I lack knowledge about the industry, about the product, about the technology, and I need to learn about the substance in order to provide the right kind of advice.
Interesting. That's interesting. Max, I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate the conversation. Want to plug Negotiation, the Game Has Changed. I have some of your other books up top over there, Negotiation Genius and The Power of Noticing, which is another book that I really love. And of course, one of my reference books, Judgment in Managerial Decision Making. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I really appreciate it. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's wonderful to get to talk to you in person, I guess, and learn from your experiences and your insights.
Pleasure.
Thank you so very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.